She arrived 2 hours early, clutching a wrinkled program in hands that hadn't stopped shaking since dawn. The university auditorium buzzed with designer suits and proud laughter, but Dorothy Williams sat in the very last row, invisible as she'd always been. Her navy dress, the same one she'd worn to church for 15 years, looked small against the marble columns and golden railings. The fabric had faded from deep navy to a softer blue-gray, and the hem showed signs of careful mending where it had caught on subway turnstiles and bus doors during countless commutes to work. Around her, families posed for photos, their joy echoing off cathedral ceilings like champagne bubbles rising to the surface. But Dorothy sat alone, watching, waiting, her weathered hands folded over a program that represented 22 years of dreams deferred and sacrifices made in silence. Nobody knew that the woman they'd walked past for 4 years, the one who cleaned their dorm bathrooms at 3 a.m. while they slept off their parties, the one who emptied their trash cans filled with takeout containers that cost more than her daily wage, the one who scrubbed vomit from their floors without complaint, was about to witness her son become the first doctor in their family's history. The irony wasn't lost on her. For 4 years, she had been part of the invisible workforce that kept this prestigious institution running. She knew every corner of every building, every stain on every carpet, every broken tile in every bathroom. She had cleaned the very stage where her son would soon stand. She had polished the podium from which he would speak. She had mopped the floors that hundreds of proud families would walk across today. But she had never been invited to walk across them herself. Until today. Dorothy's eyes swept across the auditorium, taking in details that others missed. She noticed the fresh flowers, white lilies and baby's breath that she had helped arrange at 5 a.m. She saw the gleaming brass railings that bore her fingerprints from hours of polishing. She recognized the marble columns that she had cleaned countless times, removing the scuff marks left by careless students and visiting dignitaries. This place was as much hers as anyone's. She had earned her right to be here through sweat and sacrifice, through nights when her back ached so badly she could barely stand, through mornings when her hands were so raw from cleaning chemicals that she had to wrap them in bandages before going to her second job. Yet she sat in the back, as she always had, not because she was ashamed, but because she understood her place in this world of privilege and prestige. She was the foundation upon which dreams were built, but foundations are meant to be invisible, buried beneath the surface, holding everything up without recognition or applause. The program in her hands was damp with nervous perspiration. She had read it so many times that she could recite every name, every honor, every achievement listed within its pages. But there was only one name that mattered to her. Only one achievement that had cost her everything and given her everything in return. Marcus Williams, M.D., summa cum laude. Her son, her miracle, her vindication. The whispers around her were growing louder now, as more families filled the auditorium. She caught fragments of conversations, discussions of summer homes in the Hamptons, debates about which Ivy League school was truly superior, complaints about the difficulty of finding good help these days. The irony cut deep, but Dorothy had learned long ago to let such comments roll off her like water off a duck's back. She checked her watch, a simple Timex that had been a Christmas gift from Marcus 3 years ago, the first gift he'd been able to afford since starting medical school. 2 hours until the ceremony began. 2 hours until the moment she had dreamed of since the day she first held her newborn son in her arms and promised him a better life than the one she had known. The auditorium continued to fill around her, a sea of privilege and expectation. Designer handbags worth more than her annual salary sat casually on velvet seats. Jewelry that could have paid her rent for a year caught the light from crystal chandeliers. Conversations flowed in the easy cadence of people who had never known want, never felt the gnawing anxiety of choosing between groceries and electricity, never worked 3 jobs just to keep a roof over their child's head. But Dorothy belonged here too, not because of her dress or her jewelry or her bank account, but because of her sacrifice, because of her love, because of her unwavering belief that her son could rise above the circumstances of his birth and claim his place among the elite. She had paid for this moment with 22 years of her life. 22 years of putting his dreams before her own comfort, his future before her present needs, his success before her own recognition. And now, finally, that investment was about to pay dividends. The woman beside her, a perfectly coiffed blonde in a Chanel suit, glanced over with barely concealed curiosity. Dorothy met her gaze with quiet dignity, neither apologizing for her presence nor explaining her right to be there. She simply existed, as she always had, with the quiet strength of someone who had earned her place through sacrifice rather than inheritance. In her purse, a simple black bag that had seen better days but still served its purpose, Dorothy carried a folded tissue, a small bottle of water, and a photograph. The photograph was old, creased from years of handling, showing a young Marcus in his high school graduation cap and gown. He was smiling in the picture, but his eyes held the same determination they carried today, the same fire that had driven him through 4 years of undergraduate study, 4 years of medical school, and countless obstacles that would have broken a lesser spirit. That photograph had traveled with her everywhere, to night shifts at the hospital where she worked as a custodian, to early morning shifts at the office building where she cleaned executive suites, to weekend jobs caring for elderly patients who reminded her of the grandmother who had raised her after her own mother died too young. Now, finally, she would have a new photograph to carry. One of her son receiving his medical degree. One of the moment when all her sacrifices were validated, all her struggles justified, all her dreams realized. The auditorium was nearly full now, the excited chatter of hundreds of families creating a symphony of anticipation. Dorothy closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel the weight of this moment. 22 years of invisible labor, of thankless sacrifice, of quiet dignity in the face of indifference and sometimes outright hostility. But she had persevered. They had persevered. And today, the world would finally see what she had always known, that love and determination could overcome any obstacle, that dreams deferred were not dreams denied, and that sometimes the greatest victories belong to those who had fought the hardest battles in silence. She opened her eyes and looked toward the stage where her son would soon stand. The same stage she had cleaned just hours before, making sure every surface gleamed for this moment. Her moment. Their moment. The invisible woman was about to become visible, and the world would never be the same. The auditorium filled with the elite of society, senators' wives in Chanel suits, tech moguls checking stock prices between speeches, third-generation alumni whose names adorned buildings. The Hartwell family donated the new library wing, whispered one woman, diamonds catching the light. Oh yes, their son is graduating summa cum laude, replied another, Harvard Medical School next fall. They spoke of legacies and connections, of summer homes and trust funds. Their children had been groomed for this moment since birth. Private tutors, SAT prep, college consultants who charged more than Dorothy made in a year. But they didn't know about the other Hartwell graduating today. The one whose mother had scrubbed their children's vomit from bathroom floors. The one who'd studied by candlelight when the electricity was cut off. Dorothy's eyes found the name in her program. Marcus Williams, MD, summa cum laude. She'd kept her maiden name when his father left. Kept it through the eviction notices, the double shifts, the nights she fell asleep standing up. Dorothy Williams was 17 when she found out she was pregnant. The father, a boy from her high school who promised her the world, disappeared the moment she told him the news. Her own mother, a woman hardened by her own struggles, looked at Dorothy with a mixture of disappointment and resignation. "You've thrown your life away," she said, shaking her head, "just like I did, just like your grandmother did. This family is cursed to repeat the same mistakes. But Dorothy felt something different stirring in her chest as she placed her hand on her still flat stomach. Not shame, not regret, but determination. A fierce, protective love that would define the next 2 decades of her life. "No," she whispered to herself in the mirror of their cramped bathroom. "This ends with me. This baby will have everything I never had." The rejection letter trembled in 12-year-old Marcus's hands. "Mom, I didn't get into the magnet school." Dorothy knelt beside him in their 1-bedroom apartment, roaches scurrying across cracked linoleum. The walls were thin enough that they could hear their neighbor's television, the couple upstairs fighting, the sound of sirens that had become the soundtrack to their lives. "Baby, sometimes the door you want doesn't open because there's a better one waiting," she said, taking the letter from his hands and setting it aside. "You know what this means?" Marcus shook his head, tears threatening to spill. "It means we're going to make our own school, right here, you and me." She was already working 3 jobs, cleaning offices at night from 11 p.m. to 6 a.m., stocking shelves at a grocery store from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m., and watching Neighbors. Kids in the evenings for extra cash. Her body ached constantly, her hands were permanently stained with cleaning chemicals, and she hadn't had a full night's sleep in years. But that evening, after Marcus went to bed, she walked 6 blocks to the public library in the rain. She checked out every book on homeschooling she could find, along with advanced textbooks in mathematics, science, and literature. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, looked at her with curiosity. "Planning to go back to school?" she asked kindly. "Something like that," Dorothy replied, hefting the heavy bag of books. "Something like that." The alarm clock screamed at 5:30 a.m. every morning. Dorothy would rise in the darkness, her body protesting every movement. She'd prepare breakfast for Marcus, usually oatmeal or eggs when they could afford them, cereal when they couldn't. While he ate, she'd review his lessons for the day, making sure she understood the material well enough to help him. At 6:45 a.m., she'd walk him to the bus stop for his part-time enrollment in public school for subjects she couldn't teach: art, music, physical education. Then she'd rush to her morning job at the grocery store, where she'd spend 8 hours on her feet, lifting boxes, dealing with rude customers, and pretending she didn't notice when her coworkers whispered about the welfare mom who worked too hard. Afternoons were for Marcus. They'd sit at their small kitchen table, surrounded by library books and worksheets she'd photocopied at the library for 5 cents a page. She'd help him with algebra while dinner cooked on the stove, usually rice and beans, sometimes with a piece of chicken if it was on sale. "Mom, why don't you go to school too?" Marcus asked one day when he was 13, watching her struggle with a chemistry problem. "Because you're my school," she replied, finally understanding the concept and explaining it to him with pride. "Teaching you teaches me. We're learning together." Her hands told the story of her sacrifice. They were cracked and dry from cleaning chemicals, scarred from broken glass she'd cleaned up in office buildings, calloused from lifting heavy boxes. But they were gentle when they helped Marcus with his homework, steady when they held him during nightmares, strong when they worked to provide for their small family of 2. Marcus was 14 when he became fascinated with biology. He'd spend hours at the library looking at pictures of cells and organisms, dreaming of seeing them up close. For weeks, he talked about nothing but microscopes, how they worked, what he could discover with one. Dorothy listened to his excitement and made a decision that would haunt her finances for months. Her grandmother's wedding ring, the only valuable thing she owned, the only connection to a family history that stretched back generations, sat in a small jewelry box on her dresser. She took it to 3 pawn shops before finding one that would give her enough money. $400 for a ring that was worth far more, but it was enough to buy Marcus a decent microscope from a scientific supply company. When she presented it to him on his 15th birthday, Marcus cried. Not just from joy, but from understanding. He was old enough to know what sacrifices his mother made, old enough to recognize the weight of her love. "Mom, you didn't have to." "Yes, I did," she interrupted, watching him set up the microscope with trembling hands. Your dreams are worth more than any ring. That night, Marcus looked at everything under his new microscope: drops of water, pieces of leaves, strands of his own hair. Dorothy sat beside him, marveling at the tiny worlds they discovered together. "Look, Mom," he whispered, adjusting the focus. "Look how beautiful everything is when you can really see it." Dorothy looked through the eyepiece and gasped at the intricate patterns, the hidden complexity of what seems simple to the naked eye. "Just like people," she said softly. "Sometimes you have to look closer to see how beautiful they really are." "Marcus Williams, valedictorian," the principal announced. Dorothy sat in the back row of the high school auditorium, wearing the same navy dress she'd wear years later to his medical school graduation. She'd bought it specifically for this moment, spending money they couldn't afford because she wanted to look dignified for her son's achievement. As Marcus walked across the stage, Dorothy's mind flashed through the years, the late nights helping with homework, the mornings when they had no food but she sent him to school anyway, the times she'd worked double shifts to pay for his SAT prep books. When Marcus took the microphone to give his valedictorian speech, his eyes found hers in the crowd. "I want to thank the woman who taught me that intelligence isn't inherited, it's earned," he said, his voice carrying across the auditorium. "My mother showed me that education isn't about the school you attend, but about the dedication you bring to learning." Dorothy's tears came then, hot and unstoppable. Around her, other parents nodded politely, not understanding the magnitude of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a graduation speech. It was the culmination of a promise made 17 years earlier by a teenage mother who refused to let circumstances define her child's future. After the ceremony, the guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, pulled Dorothy aside. She was a kind woman who had watched Marcus's progress with amazement over the years. "Mrs. Williams, Marcus has been accepted to Harvard with a full scholarship," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "Full tuition, room and board. It's unprecedented for a student from our district." Dorothy felt the world tilt. Harvard. The word seemed too big, too impossible for their small life. "But medical school," Mrs. Patterson continued, her expression growing serious. "That's another 4 years, another $100,000 in loans, even with scholarships. It's a significant financial commitment." Dorothy looked across the parking lot, where Marcus was taking pictures with his classmates. He was laughing, his cap tilted at an angle, his future spread out before him like a golden road. "He's going to be a doctor," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes, he's going to be a doctor." Mrs. Patterson studied Dorothy's face, seeing something there that made her nod with respect. "I believe he will," she said quietly. "With a mother like you, I believe he will." That night, Dorothy and Marcus celebrated with a dinner at McDonald's, the fanciest restaurant they could afford. As they sat in the plastic booth, sharing fries and dreams, Dorothy made another silent promise. She would work harder, save more, sacrifice whatever was necessary. Her son was going to Harvard, and nothing, not poverty, not doubt, not the whispers of people who thought kids like Marcus didn't belong in places like Harvard, would stop them. The invisible woman was about to become the mother of a Harvard student, and that was just the beginning. Harvard's campus gleamed like a postcard, all ivy and privilege, stretching as far as the eye could see. Ancient brick buildings stood like monuments to centuries of tradition. Their windows reflecting the morning sun like golden eyes watching over the newest generation of America's elite. Dorothy arrived for move-in day in a borrowed pickup truck that wheezed and coughed its way through the wrought iron gates, past manicured lawns that probably cost more to maintain than she made in a month. Her life savings, $347 in crumpled bills, was tucked in an envelope marked Marcus's emergency fund in her careful handwriting. She'd counted and recounted that money a dozen times, knowing it wouldn't last long, but hoping it would be enough to get him started. She watched other families unload SUVs and luxury sedans full of designer bedding, mini fridges, and electronics that cost more than her annual rent. Parents hugged their children goodbye with the casual confidence of people who knew this was just another step in a predetermined path to success. They promised care packages filled with gourmet treats, spring break trips to Europe, and summer internships at companies where they had connections. Dorothy hugged Marcus in the shadow of that borrowed truck, her hands trembling as she smoothed his shirt collar one last time. "You belong here," she whispered, her voice fierce with conviction. "Don't let anyone tell you different. Don't let them make you feel small." But even as she said the words, Dorothy could see the doubt creeping into her son's eyes. Belonging and fitting in were different things, and they both knew it. "Where are you from?" his roommate Bradley Whitman III asked on the first day, eyeing Marcus's 3 shirts hanging in the closet next to Bradley's walk-in wardrobe worth more than most people's cars. "Boston," Marcus replied carefully, not mentioning the housing project in Roxbury or the fact that his mother was at that very moment cleaning the bathroom down the hall. Bradley nodded absently, already losing interest. "Cool. My family has a place in Beacon Hill. Maybe you know it?" Marcus knew Beacon Hill. He'd delivered groceries there during high school, walking through neighborhoods where the townhouses cost millions and the residents looked through him like he was invisible. The cultural divide became apparent immediately. Study groups met at expensive restaurants in Harvard Square, where a single meal cost more than Dorothy spent on groceries in a week. Spring break meant ski trips to Aspen or beach houses in the Hamptons. Summer internships were unpaid positions at prestigious firms that only trust fund kids could afford to take. Marcus worked in the cafeteria during his free periods, serving food to classmates who looked through him like glass. He recognized some of them from his classes, students who would nod politely during seminars but never invited him to their exclusive study sessions or weekend parties. He studied while they partied, slept while they networked, and slowly, quietly, began to excel in ways that made them uncomfortable. His grades were higher, his insights sharper, his work ethic unmatched. But success, he learned, wasn't just about merit in a place like Harvard. "You're so articulate," a classmate named Stephanie said after Marcus gave a presentation on healthcare disparities. She meant it as a compliment, but the surprise in her voice cut deep. "Thanks," Marcus replied evenly, though inside he burned with the implication that his intelligence was somehow unexpected. During group projects, he noticed how his ideas were often overlooked until a white classmate repeated them and received credit. In study groups, he was frequently asked to explain the minority perspective, as if his race defined the entirety of his worldview. "How did you get into Harvard?" became a question he heard so often it felt like a greeting. The assumption was always there, that he hadn't earned his place, that he was filling some quota rather than excelling on his own merit. "I don't understand how you're outperforming everyone," Professor Richardson said during office hours, his tone carrying an edge of suspicion. "Your background, it's not typical for our top students." Marcus's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists beneath the desk. "What exactly do you mean by background, sir?" Professor Richardson backtracked quickly, sensing he'd crossed a line. "I just mean, well, you know, students from your circumstances usually struggle more with the academic rigor." "My circumstances?" Marcus's voice was dangerously quiet. "I didn't mean anything by it," the professor said, but the damage was done. The message was clear. Marcus didn't look like success was supposed to look. That night, Marcus called his mother, his voice thick with frustration and hurt. "Maybe I don't belong here, Mom," he said. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm just fooling myself." Dorothy was on her break from the night shift, sitting in a supply closet because it was the only quiet place she could find. Her hands were raw from cleaning chemicals. Her back ached from hours of mopping floors. But her voice was steady and strong. "Baby, listen to me," she said. You belong anywhere your mind can take you. Don't let their ignorance make you doubt what I've always known. You're extraordinary." Meanwhile, Dorothy worked the night shift in the very dorms where her son slept. She'd arrive at 11 p.m. when the students were either studying or partying, and work until 6 a.m. cleaning up the evidence of their privileged lives. She'd see Marcus's light on at 2 a.m. and feel a surge of pride, knowing he was studying while his classmates slept off their expensive dinners and social gatherings. She'd empty trash cans filled with takeout containers from restaurants that charged $30 for a sandwich, designer clothing tags from shopping sprees that cost more than her monthly salary, and discarded electronics that still worked perfectly but had been replaced by newer models. The waste was staggering, but Dorothy didn't judge. She simply cleaned and observed and marveled at the casual abundance that surrounded her son's daily life. Sometimes she'd encounter students in the hallways, young people stumbling back from parties, their designer clothes wrinkled, their voices loud with alcohol and entitlement. They'd step around her as if she were furniture, never making eye contact, never acknowledging her humanity. But Dorothy didn't mind being invisible. She'd been invisible her whole life. What mattered was that Marcus was visible, that he was claiming his place in this world of privilege and proving that brilliance could come from anywhere. During Marcus's sophomore year, he was invited to a scholarship dinner for high-achieving students. Dorothy wasn't invited. The event was for students only, but she helped him prepare, pressing his one good shirt and giving him the confidence he needed to walk into a room full of donors and administrators. At the dinner, Marcus sat at a table with other scholarship recipients and wealthy donors who funded their educations. The conversation flowed around topics he couldn't relate to: vacation homes, private jets, charitable foundations that gave away more money in a year than most people would see in a lifetime. "So Marcus," said Mrs. Pemberton, a major donor whose family name was on 3 buildings, "tell us about your family. What do your parents do?" Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest. He could lie, create a more palatable version of his truth. Or he could be honest and watch their expressions change. "My mother works in facilities management," he said carefully. It was technically true. Dorothy did manage the cleanliness of the facilities she was assigned to clean. "How wonderful," Mrs. Pemberton replied with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And your father?" "He's not in the picture," Marcus said simply. The conversation moved on quickly, but Marcus caught the exchanged glances, the subtle shift in body language. He was a charity case to them, a feel-good story that made their donations tax-deductible and their consciences clear. But he kept working, kept believing, kept proving that he belonged not because of their charity, but because of his merit. By junior year, Marcus had established himself as one of the top students in his pre-med program. His grades were impeccable, his research impressive, his recommendations glowing. But social acceptance remained elusive. The exclusive study groups that met in private dining rooms and luxury apartments never extended invitations to him. The networking events that happened at country clubs and private homes were closed to him not by explicit exclusion, but by the simple fact that he didn't move in those circles. He formed his own study group with other scholarship students and international students, the ones who, like him, existed on the margins of Harvard's social hierarchy. They met in the library, in empty classrooms, in the common areas of dorms. They shared notes and knowledge freely, supporting each other in ways that the privileged students, with their competitive individualism, never did. It was in this group that Marcus found his true peers, students who understood struggle, who appreciated opportunity, who worked twice as hard for half the recognition. Every semester, Dorothy would receive Marcus's grades in the mail. She'd open the envelope with trembling hands, her heart racing with anticipation and fear. And every semester, she'd see the same thing: straight A's, dean's list, academic honors. She'd sit in their small apartment, holding the transcript like a precious artifact, tears streaming down her face. Not just from pride, but from the bittersweet knowledge that her son was succeeding in a world that would never fully accept him, never fully acknowledge the journey he'd taken to get there. She kept every transcript, every honor society invitation, every letter of recognition in a small box beside her bed. On her hardest days, when her body ached from physical labor, when the bills seemed insurmountable, when the loneliness of her sacrifice felt overwhelming, she'd open that box and remember why it was all worth it. But she also saw the toll it was taking on Marcus, the way his shoulders carried tension that hadn't been there in high school, the careful way he spoke about his classmates, never quite calling them friends, the isolation that came from being exceptional in a place that expected excellence but questioned his right to achieve it. She wanted to protect him, to shield him from the microaggressions and subtle exclusions that she knew he faced daily. But she also knew that this was his battle to fight, his mountain to climb. All she could do was continue to be his foundation, his safe harbor, his reminder that he was loved and valued, regardless of what the world thought of him. Senior year brought the stress of medical school applications. Marcus spent countless hours crafting personal statements, studying for the MCAT, and preparing for interviews. The process was expensive. Application fees, test prep materials, travel costs for interviews, and Dorothy worked extra shifts to cover the expenses. She watched him agonize over every word of his personal statement, trying to tell his story in a way that would resonate with admissions committees, without seeming like he was asking for pity. How do I explain where I come from without making it sound like I'm making excuses? He asked her one night, frustrated and exhausted. You tell the truth, Dorothy replied simply. You tell them that you've seen what happens when healthcare isn't accessible, when people suffer not because medicine can't help them, but because they can't afford it. You tell them that you want to be part of the solution. But even as she gave him advice, Dorothy worried. She knew that medical school would be even more competitive, even more exclusive than Harvard had been. She knew that the financial burden would be enormous, that the social pressures would be intense, that her son would face even greater challenges in the years ahead. Still, she never wavered in her belief that he would succeed, because she had seen him overcome every obstacle so far, had watched him turn every challenge into an opportunity to prove his worth. The invisible woman continued to work in the shadows, supporting her son's dreams while remaining unseen by the world that was slowly, reluctantly, beginning to recognize his brilliance. The MCAT scores arrived on a Tuesday. Marcus stared at the envelope for 10 minutes before opening it. Perfect score. He called Dorothy at work. She was cleaning a bathroom in the medical school building, the same one he'd soon attend. Mom, I got a perfect score. Dorothy dropped her mop, sank to her knees on the tile floor she'd just cleaned, and sobbed. Not from sadness, but from a joy so pure it felt like prayer answered. Why do you want to be a doctor? The interviewer asked. Marcus thought of his mother's hands, cracked from chemicals, of nights she came home too tired to eat, of the way she'd study his textbooks after he went to sleep, determined to help with homework she barely understood. Because I've seen what happens when healthcare isn't accessible, he said. When people suffer not because medicine can't help them, but because they can't afford it. The interviewer nodded, impressed by his passion, never knowing it came from watching his mother ration insulin for their diabetic neighbor because she couldn't afford her prescription. Harvard Medical School, full scholarship. Dorothy held the letter with shaking hands, reading it over and over until the words blurred. We did it, baby, she whispered to the empty apartment. We actually did it. But even in triumph, she remained invisible. The acceptance letter mentioned Marcus's unique perspective and diverse background, but never acknowledged the woman who'd made it possible. Dorothy arrived at 6 a.m. for the 10 a.m. ceremony. She wanted to see everything: the setup, the flowers, the careful choreography of privilege. She watched families arrive in luxury cars, their joy effortless and expected. She saw mothers in designer dresses, fathers in custom suits, grandparents with tears of pride already forming. And she sat in the back, in her 15-year-old navy dress, holding a program that represented 22 years of sacrifice. The whispers started early. Is that woman supposed to be here? She looks out of place. Security should check her invitation. Dorothy heard them all. She'd been hearing them her whole life. But today was different. Today she had every right to be here. The ceremony begins. Names were called in alphabetical order. Each graduate walked across the stage to thunderous applause from their section. Families cheered, cameras flashed, pride filled the air like perfume. Dorothy waited. Williams came near the end. Around her, the whispers grew louder. I heard there's a scholarship student graduating today. Affirmative action, probably. It's good for their image, you know. Diversity. Dorothy's hands clenched around her program. She'd heard it all before, about Marcus's acceptance, his scholarships, his success. Always qualified, always questioned, never quite enough. But she knew the truth. She knew the nights he'd studied until dawn, the jobs he'd worked to pay for application fees, the way he'd helped classmates who struggled with concepts he'd mastered years ago. She knew her son had earned every honor, every accolade, every moment of this day. The name echoed through the auditorium like thunder. Dorothy's breath caught. This was it. The moment she'd dreamed of for 22 years. Marcus walked across the stage, tall and proud in his cap and gown. The applause was polite, scattered, nothing like the roaring ovations that had greeted other names. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of accepting his diploma and walking off, Marcus stopped at the microphone. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium. "But before I accept this honor, I need to say something." The dean looked confused. This wasn't in the program. Marcus's eyes found Dorothy in the back row. For the first time all day, she wasn't invisible. 22 years ago, a 17-year-old girl became pregnant and was told she'd never amount to anything, that her son would follow the same path: poverty, struggle, failure. The auditorium fell silent. Even the whispers stopped. That girl worked 3 jobs to keep us housed. She studied alongside me when she barely had a high school education herself. She cleaned the very buildings where I learned to dream of becoming a doctor. Dorothy's hands flew to her mouth. He wasn't supposed to tell them. They'd agreed to keep it private. She's here today, sitting in the back row, because that's where she's always sat. Invisible, unnoticed, unappreciated. Heads turned, cameras swiveled. Suddenly, every eye in the auditorium was on Dorothy. "Mom, stand up." Dorothy shook her head, tears streaming. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. "Mom, please, stand up." Slowly, shakily, Dorothy rose to her feet. "This woman," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger, "cleaned your dorm rooms while you slept. She scrubbed your bathrooms while you partied. She worked nights so I could study days." The silence was deafening. Students who'd never noticed the cleaning staff suddenly remembered glimpses. A woman in a uniform, always working, always invisible. She never asked for recognition, never demanded credit. She just worked and believed and sacrificed everything so I could stand here today. Marcus's voice cracked with emotion. "Every A I earned, she earned. Every honor I received, she deserved. Every door that opened for me, she pushed open with her bare hands." In the audience, something was shifting. The polite distance was cracking. Faces that had been indifferent were now focused, moved, ashamed. I know some of you wondered how I got here, questioned whether I belonged, whispered about affirmative action and diversity quotas. The uncomfortable truth hung in the air. Let me be clear. I earned my place here, but I didn't do it alone. The woman in the back row, Dorothy Williams, she's the reason I'm here. She's the reason any of us can achieve our dreams." Marcus paused, looking directly at his mother. "Mom, you've spent your whole life making other people's children successful. Today, your child succeeds because of you." What happened next would be talked about for years. It started with one student, a young woman in the front row who'd been served breakfast by Dorothy countless times without ever saying thank you. She stood up, tears streaming down her face. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire graduating class was on their feet. Not the polite, obligatory applause of ceremony, but something deeper, something real. The standing ovation spread like wildfire. Students, faculty, families, everyone rising in recognition of a woman they've overlooked for years. But Dorothy wasn't looking at them. She was looking at her son, the boy she'd raised to be a man, the dream she'd nurtured into reality. Marcus stepped away from the podium and walked down from the stage, past the front rows of privilege, past the middle sections of comfort, all the way to the back where his mother stood. He knelt before her, not in submission, but in reverence. "We did it, Mom. We actually did it." Dorothy's composure finally broke. 22 years of strength, of holding it together, of being invisible. It all came pouring out in tears of joy, relief, and overwhelming love. The auditorium erupted. The applause was thunderous now, genuine, transformative. People weren't just clapping for Marcus anymore. They were clapping for Dorothy, for sacrifice, for love, for the invisible heroes who make dreams possible. The dean approached the microphone, visibly moved. "In 30 years of graduation ceremonies, I've never witnessed anything like this," he said. "Mrs. Williams, would you please join your son on stage?" Dorothy shook her head, overwhelmed. But Marcus took her hand. "Come on, Mom. It's time." Together, they walked down the aisle. The same aisle Dorothy had cleaned countless times, now lined with people standing in her honor. On stage, the dean presented Marcus with his diploma. But then he did something unprecedented. "Mrs. Williams, Harvard Medical School would like to present you with an honorary recognition for your extraordinary dedication to education and your son's success." The crowd erupted again. Dorothy accepted the certificate with shaking hands, still unable to believe this was real. Marcus took the microphone one final time. "To every parent here, every family member, every person who sacrificed for someone else's dream, this is for you too. Success isn't individual, it's collective. It's built on love, sacrifice, and the belief that our children can be better than we ever imagined." He looked at his mother, standing beside him in her 15-year-old dress, holding an honorary certificate from Harvard Medical School. "Mom, you've been invisible long enough. Today, the world sees what I've always known. You're extraordinary." The ceremony ended, but the story was just beginning. Within hours, videos of Marcus's speech were viral. #InvisibleHeroes trended worldwide. News outlets picked up the story, but this time, Dorothy wasn't just mentioned, she was centered. Interview requests poured in. Book deals were offered. Speaking engagements were proposed. Dorothy declined them all. "I didn't raise my son for fame," she told the reporters gathered outside their small apartment. "I raised him to help people. That's what matters." But the impact was undeniable. Harvard established the Dorothy Williams Scholarship for children of service workers. Other universities followed suit. The invisible became visible, not just Dorothy, but thousands of others like her. Marcus started his residency in emergency medicine, choosing to work in the same neighborhood where he'd grown up. His first patient was Mrs. Rodriguez, their old neighbor who'd shared insulin with Dorothy years ago. "Dr. Williams," she said, recognizing him immediately. "Your mama must be so proud." "She is," Marcus smiled, "and she finally knows the world is proud of her too." 5 years later, Dr. Marcus Williams opened a free clinic in his old neighborhood. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was small, intimate, nothing like the grand graduation that had changed everything. Dorothy was there, of course, not in the back row this time, but front and center. Wearing a new dress, the first she'd bought for herself in 20 years. The clinic's waiting room featured a simple plaque, in honor of Dorothy Williams and all the invisible heroes who make dreams possible. Your sacrifices are seen, your love is honored, your legacy lives on. A young mother sat in the waiting room, holding her sick child, worry etched on her face. She couldn't afford the specialist her son needed, couldn't take time off work for multiple appointments. Dorothy sat beside her, taking her hand. "What's your son's name?" she asked gently. "Miguel. He wants to be a doctor someday, but—" The woman's voice trailed off. "But nothing," Dorothy said firmly. "Dreams don't have prerequisites except love and determination. Trust me, I know." Through the window, they could see Dr. Williams with his patients, children from the neighborhood, elderly residents, families who'd never been able to afford quality health care. "My son," Dorothy said quietly, "he's living his dream, but more importantly, he's helping others live theirs." The young mother squeezed Dorothy's hand. "How did you do it? How did you make it possible?" Dorothy smiled, thinking of all the nights, all the sacrifices, all the moments when giving up would have been easier. One day at a time, one belief at a time, one dream at a time. She looked at the plaque on the wall, at her son helping patients, at the community that had embraced them both. And sometimes, she added, the world finally sees what was always there. Outside, a new group of medical students walked by, diverse faces, different backgrounds, dreams as big as the sky. Some came from privilege, others from struggle, but all of them carried the hopes of someone who believed in them. Dorothy watched them pass and smiled. The invisible were becoming visible, one dream at a time. And in that small clinic, in that big world, love continued to make the impossible possible.